Hello, how are you guys doing today? I hope everybody is doing well. Today, Grandma wants to share a story about Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone was one of these famous American heroes, pioneers, adventurers. And he was an adventurer from very early in his life. And he was blazing trails westward even before the 13 colonies had freed themselves from Britain. And he helped establish what was called the Wilderness Road, in one of the first American settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains. So this is about Daniel Boone. He was born on November 2nd, 1734, in a log cabin in Pennsylvania. He was the sixth of 11 children born to Squire and Sarah Boone. It's an interesting first name for his father, Squire. The Boones were Quakers who came to Pennsylvania from England seeking religious freedom. Squire Boone, his father, was a blacksmith, a weaver, and a farmer. He also kept a herd of cattle. He was a restless man, not happy in one place for long. His son Daniel would be restless too. I think that might have been why he became such an adventurer, taking after his father too. Daniel was a lively and curious child. He often forgot his chores and instead wandered in the nearby woods. When he was about 12 years old, his father gave him his first rifle. I think children were given guns much earlier than they are today. After that, he often disappeared for days at a time. When he returned, he would have enough meat to feed his family for a week. Squire's, his father's brother, John, was a school teacher. He complained that his nephew Daniel wasn't given a formal education. "Let the girls do the spelling," Squire Boone told his brother. "Dan will do the shooting. And between you and me, that is what we most need." In 1751, the Boones moved south. They settled in North Carolina in an area with a lot of fish, wild turkey, deer, and bears. Now, in the 1750s, England and France controlled much of the settled areas of North America. And in 1754, the French and Indian War broke out. It was a fight between France and Britain to control America. And the Native Americans were divided, but mostly they sided with the French. In June and July 1755, 20-year-old Daniel Boone was a wagon driver in the service of Major General Edward Braddock, who led an attack against the French stronghold by the Ohio River. One of the approximately 1,500 British and colonial soldiers who marched with Braddock was Colonel George Washington. I'm sure you've heard of him before. So they were fighting against the French in the company of General Braddock. He was the commanding officer. The French and Native Americans hid in bushes and behind rocks and trees. Braddock's men stood in the open and were easy targets in their bright red uniforms. They would fight, one British officer reported, if they could see their enemy. And it was that type of attitude that got the British in trouble when the Americans' war broke out. It was a terrible defeat for the British. Braddock was killed and several hundred of his men were killed or wounded. During this disastrous expedition, Daniel Boone heard a trader named John Finley talk of a land west of the Allegheny Mountains, known as Virginia. He said a hunter could stand in one place and great herds of buffalo and deer would come to him. Those were the stories that Boone remembered that would change his life. Now, after the battle, Daniel returned home. Early in the summer of 1756, he went cherry picking. He sat in the grass with 17-year-old Rebecca Bryan, a tall, pretty woman with fair skin, dark hair, and dark eyes. She was strong and independent. She was also easygoing and kind. They married in 1756 and had 10 children. They also raised 8 nieces and nephews. Their first home was on his father's land in North Carolina. So he married Rebecca, and they had 10 children eventually. As a hunter, Daniel Boone was on a constant search for better hunting ground. He was unable to stay in one place for very long. In 1765, he went with some friends on an expedition to Florida. Does that look like Florida to you? Those alligators and swamps? Then in late 1767, he set out to explore Kentucky. His first expedition was a failure. The rugged hills and winter weather forced him to turn back before reaching Kentucky. On May 1st, 1769, Boone set out again for Kentucky. 5 other men went with him. They hunted and trapped animals. In December, they were attacked by Shawnee Indians who told them they were on Shawnee ground. They took many of Boone's furs and supplies. We were often in dangerous situations, Boone later said, exposed daily to perils and death. 4 of the men left. They were on their way home when they met Daniel's brother, Squire, named after his father, who had come with supplies. They told him where to find Daniel, and the 2 brothers stayed in Kentucky until May of 1771. So that was a couple of years that he stayed in Kentucky. 2 years later, in 1773, Boone and his family and some 50 pioneers set off for Kentucky to establish a settlement there. Soon after they arrived, Boone's eldest son, James, and several others were attacked and killed by a group of Shawnee Indians. 2 years later, Boone and about 35 other pioneers cut a muddy path from northern Virginia through the Cumberland Gap along the Kentucky River to what is now Louisville, Kentucky. This route came to be called the Wilderness Trail. More settlers followed. They built a fort and named it Boonesboro in honor of Daniel Boone. The coming of the Revolutionary War with Britain did little to slow frequent Shawnee attacks. We were surrounded with enemies on every side, one settler said. In July of 1776, the Shawnee captured Boone's 14-year-old daughter, Jemina, and 2 other girls. Boone and several other men followed a trail of cloth the girls had torn from their dresses. Boone found the girls, but the Shawnee captured him and tried to kill him. They tied him to a tree, but just before he was to be killed, Boone's men came to the rescue, and Boone and the girls were saved. Now, back in those days, the Indians and the American settlers lots of times didn't get along very well. Not all the time, but quite often they didn't get along well. In 1778, he was again captured by the Shawnee, and while he was being held, he watched the Shawnee's best warriors prepare to attack Boonesboro. He managed to escape. He traveled for 4 days, a distance of 160 miles. That's 40 miles a day. That's a lot of walking. And during which I had but one meal. Can you imagine only eating once in 4 days? He returned home and warned the settlers about the coming attack. When the Shawnee came, the settlers were ready and Boonesboro was saved. In 1781, Kentucky was still part of the state of Virginia. That year, Daniel Boone was elected to represent Kentucky in the Virginia General Assembly. With the American victory in the Revolutionary War, Boone settled in what was later called Maysville, Kentucky. There he worked as a surveyor, horse trader, and land speculator. Back in those days, they had horses instead of cars. In 1799, Daniel Boone left Kentucky. He said it had become too crowded. He and his family settled in the Spanish-held Louisiana Territory in what later became the state of Missouri. That's where Grandma lives right now. There he was given land by the Spanish government and appointed judge. In 1800, Spain transferred the Louisiana Territory to France. And in 1803, it was sold to the United States in what became known as the Louisiana Purchase. You're getting a lot of history lesson in this book. Age eventually took its toll on Daniel Boone. He could no longer make long trips through the wilderness. He sang with his grandchildren and told them stories. He repaired rifles for his friends and neighbors. And then on September 26, 1820, at the age of 85, Daniel Boone died at his son's home in Missouri. Sometimes I feel like a leaf carried on a stream, Daniel Boone once wrote. It may whirl and twist, but it is always carried forward. The leaf that was Daniel Boone had led the Americans west. So he was one of those people that helped Americans move west past the mountains into what was Kentucky and Missouri. That's the central part of the United States. I just thought that was an interesting book to tell you a little bit more about some of the great Americans and some of their adventures. And I hope you're having a good day. I hope you remember that Grandma loves you. And I will talk to you later and tell you some more stories again.